Let's take a break for about 10 minutes, and then we'll talk more about the health effects. Depending on which part of your body is exposed to the radiation will have a dramatic effect on health effects. Very complex cells are much more sensitive to radiation than very simple cells. So lymph tissue, white blood cells are much more susceptible to radiation. Nerve cells, muscle cells, they're a lot less complex and therefore less sensitive to radiation. So less damage to those. Same thing with organisms. There are, in fact, most animals are way less sensitive to radiation than people. We are pretty much at the bottom of the totem pole. We're very complex. There's a lot more things that can go wrong from the interaction with the destructiveness of radiation. So certain bacteria can withstand hundreds of thousands of REMs. And what these numbers represent, they are what's called the lethal dose, 50-30, which is the lethal dose for 50% of the population over a 30-day period. So for example, a cow can, if it receives 500 REMs, a herd of cows, half of them will die within 30 days, statistically speaking. Now, if we look at people, without medical treatment, we're about 350. So if I were to expose everyone in this room to 350 REMs, and we're talking about acute exposure, minutes, hours, half of us will die within 30 days. Half of us will live. And the half that lives probably will live a very productive, healthy life. And there's a much higher chance of getting cancer later on, but it's only a chance, not a guarantee. With medical treatment, you notice the number increases dramatically, up to 500 REMs. And what that indicates is that there are ways to treat medical exposure. There are drugs that we can take, techniques that we can use to mitigate the effects of radiation on your body. And if you've ever seen the Gary Larson Far Side cartoon where there's these nuclear bomb mushroom clouds in the background, all the cockroaches are jumping up and down, going hooray, is because cockroaches will inherit the earth. Not only can you not kill them by stepping on them, but it takes incredible amounts of radiation to kill them. Now, not all exposures are equal. Just like chemicals, depends on whether it's acute or chronic, depends on whether it affects your whole body, systemic, or just a partial exposure. Your extremities, your arms and your legs can withstand much, much higher levels of radiation than your torso. Obviously, this is where all your vital organs are. There's not much going on in the arms and the legs. And of course, we've talked about internal versus external. Now, there are three types of health effects: somatic, genetic, and teratogenic. Somatic being the one that is most prevalent and most easily to observe. And that can be white blood cell loss, hair loss, sterility, cancer later on in life. Genetic is damage to your reproductive cells, your DNA. And teratogenic doesn't happen very often because we have pretty high standards on protecting the fetus, but case studies have shown a fetus is exposed to high radiation can have pretty severe effects. So let's talk about these in a little more detail. The somatic effects really start at about 25 REMs, where we can start to see some noticeable changes to your body, which is probably why EPA has chosen 25 REMs as their upper limit for emergency response activities. At about 50 REMs, we would expect some fair amount of damage to your blood system. Again, we're killing the white blood cells, starting to suppress your immune system a little bit. But even at 25 to 50 rems of exposure, by the time you were to go to a clinic or a hospital and get a blood test, and they would count your white blood cells, they would probably notice very little of any change. You make them that quickly. So you recover very, very quickly from at this level. Now you get up into the triple digits, much more severe. You start to destroy your digestive system. If you get into the thousands, well, you're attacking your nervous system, and you get up over 10,000, you have what we call molecular death, which is a very quick end to your life. What do these look like to you? Burns. These are what we call radiation burns. They're from beta radiation, high exposure to beta. A radioactive material, cesium-137, much like the check source I showed you earlier, was inadvertently applied to some folks that live in a town called Goiânia, Brazil. They had a very interesting incident there where a radioactive material was released into the environment, and it started to fluoresce, and people were putting it on their bodies and running around going, oh, look at me, I glow in the dark. And very severe exposures, 4 people died. Interesting case study. But this is what the radiation burns look like. Difficult to diagnose if you don't know what you're looking for. Now, the delayed somatic effects, what I've talked about, is cancer. And yes, there's a chance you can get cancer. And it is a known carcinogen, one of the very few known carcinogens. But it takes a while to develop. And we've observed this at over 100 REMs. It's very well documented. We know it can occur at 10 or more REMs. It's all about probability. You are already 20% chance of dying from cancer if you live in the United States. There's already a 50% chance you're going to get cancer. So half of us will get cancer before we die. 20% of us will die of cancer. If you receive 1 rem of dose, your chances of increases to 20.07%. Insignificant increase. Even 100 rems, you're only going up to 27%. So about a 30% change here, less than 30% change. Yes? Excuse me? Oh, the question is, why are we already at the 20%? Because we eat unhealthy foods, we're exposed to other toxics. It's part of just being a living organism that cells will mutate and become cancerous. I mean, there's a lot of effects that some we control, some we can't. That's a whole other epidemiological discussion. But that's statistically speaking, in this country, there's a 20% chance dying of cancer. So the radiation, yes, carcinogen, but you have to have pretty high doses to increase the chance of getting cancer and dying of it. This is an example of thyroid cancer, which we talked about earlier. Iodine affecting the thyroid, causing cancer. Genetic effects. Your DNA can mutate, and that can be passed on to your offspring, and they can have genetic effects. This has really not been observed. It's more theoretical, but it is certainly possible. And then last, but think about the DNA, however, to think about is all your cells have DNA, and your DNA is undergoing natural changes all the time. Some which are just biological, some which are caused by chemical reactions, and so on. But these changes are occurring. You can't stop it from happening. And they're happening at a ferocious rate, but your body repairs them. And for the most part, it's not a big deal. It works out. Well, if you're exposed to just background radiation, causes about 5 DNA breaks per cell per year. That's just background radiation. You know, you multiply that by even 100, it's insignificant compared to the tens of millions that are happening in each of your cells every year. So, not trying to minimize the effects of radiation, but your body has a way to deal with it. It has a very good mechanism for repairing and healing very quickly. Now, let's talk about the fetus. Anything above 20 rems is going to cause a problem. And we observed this from different accidents, mostly from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear detonations. Pregnant women had very well documented birth defects from their offspring. So nowadays, we're very protective of women who are pregnant. Now, what is going on with the radiation when it interacts with your body? Well, it's ionizing. And that ionization, because you're made up of about 70% water, is going to be ionizing mostly water. And that will form ions, which are mostly harmless to you. Some will form free radicals. Now, these free radicals are different than people who live in Berkeley. We're talking about the free radicals that can form oxidizers. I'm sorry, is anyone here from Berkeley? I don't want to offend you. Someone actually got upset for me making that joke. It's my dry sense of humor. But these free radicals combine together to make oxidizers. This is hydrogen peroxide, very strong oxidizer. It can make other toxins. It can also just alter your organic makeup. And that's the damage. So what a physician will do if you're exposed to high levels of radiation is they'll try to get rid of these free radicals. And we can give you different types of drugs that will bind them up and remove them from your system, help you flush the material out of you. One of the treatments, if you're exposed to tritium, which is a reactive material, carbon-14, comes in liquid form. It's found in a lot of exit signs. If you get the tritium on you, it absorbs into your body, you drink beer. That's the treatment. Go home and drink a couple six-packs. Dehydrate yourself, flush it out of your system. I'm not kidding. So back to this table we saw before. Again, it's really not until you get into the triple digits that you start to get relatively severe health effects. My metric is 100 rems. I'm willing to go up to 100, and then I kind of cut off there. Slight increased chance of getting cancer. I'll be up to, what, 27% chance. I'm going to probably get run over by a car before then anyways, so I'm not too worried about it. Either that or the bourbon will kill me, probably because the collection will fall on me. So, extraordinary circumstances. Now, your skin is susceptible to radiation, of course, also. Takes very high exposures, really has to be up into the thousands before you start to get serious degradation of the skin. Here are some case studies of exactly that. This fellow took a iridium-192, which is a gamma beta source, from his workplace and put it in his back pocket, and went home. He had a 6.5-hour exposure. And you can see after a couple days, the dead skin here, the little blister that's forming. A week later, the amount of air, the damage is a little more prevalent. That blister has burst. And this healing process will take many, many weeks, if not months. This is a photograph of a person's hand that was involved in the Cutaneous incident that I mentioned, where we saw the beta burns on the person's face. Well, this is someone who handled the reactive source, so had a very high exposure to the hand. You can see right here the palm, the damage. It's starting to occur. This is after 3 days. And then a few weeks, the blister has broken. You can see now the damage a little more clearly on the fingertips and such, over a larger area. After 30 days, there's some partial healing, but the body's still struggling. And then almost 2 months later, we're still going through the healing process. So it takes a while. This next is a very interesting case study where a soldier, I think this was in Russia, or one of those associated countries, had a medical procedure and had an accidental overexposure. And so we can see some of the damage here on his back after a couple months. You know, some redding, peeling of the skin. Doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. Many months later, it looks perfectly healed. Only to then, a year or so later, the skin starts to die again. And so it's this cycle of repair, dying, repair, and dying. And this could go on for years. It's not going to kill him. It's kind of a bummer, but he'll survive. Now, we've talked about the radioactivity of materials, but they're also chemicals. And chemicals, as you know, can be harmful to you. Well, uranium is found as uranium oxide. And I mentioned this before. And that's a heavy metal, very toxic to the human body. And as a chemical, it can be much more dangerous than the reactivity. And the reactivity, or the material doesn't care that it's radioactive. It's a chemical. It's going to interact with your body like a chemical. Take table salt. Sodium chloride, necessary for human life. Well, being a chemist, and the devious chemist that I can be, I can take ordinary salt, remove the chlorine-35, and attach a chlorine-36, which is radioactive, beta emitter. It's going to look just like salt, going to taste just like salt. And it will go through your entire body just like it is salt. Now you've got internal contamination, the beta emitter. Not a good thing. They come in the forms of gases, liquids, and solids. All different forms. So you have to be aware that they're chemicals too, and the chemical component is also dangerous, or could be dangerous. I like this chart because it really kind of summarizes the health effects very succinctly. We've got low exposures of radiation from all different types of sources. You know, background is typically at around this level here. We don't see any effect whatsoever to our bodies until we get to about 25 rem. We see some decrease in our white blood cells, as I mentioned before. It's not until the triple digits that you start to see more severe effects. And it's not until you get up into the multi-hundreds the potential to kill you. And then when you reach 1,000 rems, that's pretty much guaranteed that you're going to die. That would be our LD 100, 100% chance of dying. I don't think anyone's ever survived an exposure above 1,000 rems.
Just for clarity, it's per hour, per day, for what? These exposures?
So what is the exposure time period for this, say, 1,000 rem? It would be acute. And it could be a minute, an hour, a couple days. The more time your body has to heal, the more radiation you can be exposed to. So could I be exposed to 1,000 rems over several weeks and survive? Probably. Probably. It all just depends on the amount I get, you know, and the time frames between the exposures. The Cutaneous example that I showed, the person with the skin beta burns in the hand, there was one person who handled the source who actually survived, had, I think, in the realms of 600-700 rem exposure, but because it was for a couple hours today and a couple hours tomorrow and a couple hours the next day, the exposure was spread out just enough that he was able to survive, whereas other people had a lesser dose, but more acute, shorter time frames, and they didn't make it. So there's a lot of variables there. Any questions about health effects? Let's talk about how to protect yourself. There are 3 methods, and only 3 methods, that you can use to protect yourself: time, distance, and shielding. They're pretty simple. Time is the obvious one. You reduce your time, you reduce your exposure. That's easy. As I mentioned, again, looking at this chart, if you're trying not to exceed 25 REMs, even if you're at really high dose rates, you still have a fair amount of time to do work if you're a rescuer, to rescue someone, but it's all about that time. Gotta have the time and the exposure rate. Those are the 2 variables. Now, distance. This is probably the most important way to protect yourself, because as you increase your distance, you decrease your exposure dramatically. And such that when you double your distance, you decrease your exposure to a quarter of what it was before. And the best way is, look at this example here. If we have a source at 1 foot away, we're at 32 milli-Roentgen per hour. If I double the distance to 2 feet, my exposure rate is going to drop to 8 milli-Roentgen per hour, 25% of that. I double my distance again to 4 feet, and now I'm down to 2, like 1/16th of what it was just 3 feet away. So you walk into an area with your radiation detector, and all of a sudden, the meter starts going up. No reason to panic. Just step back a few feet, and it's going to come down. It's very easy to deal with. And then finally is shielding. Remember beta? Was that an external hazard? No. Beta is not, I'm sorry, alpha. I'll start with alpha. Alpha, not an external hazard. You don't need to wear protective clothing with alpha. Beta can be an external hazard if you get it on your skin. So most protective clothing, Tyvek, other types of material will just keep it, gloves, booties, will keep it off your skin and keep you from getting contaminated. That's not really shielding. It's just a way to reduce contamination. Gamma will go right through your body, certainly can go through any protective gear you're wearing. So there's no way to really shield ourselves from the radiation. There are techniques you can use to help shield yourself from sources if you're in a long-term cleanup type of environment. We had a facility in LA. We were doing a cleanup and we built this, what we call a water wall. These are 5-gallon buckets full of water, stacked them up 2 deep, and now it absorbs a lot of the radiation and reduces our exposure. We can do our work behind here and reduce the health effects. Not very practical in very many situations, though. So these goofy little cartoons here kind of illustrate some of the principles here of times, distance, and shielding. So we got the guy on the left who's got a radioactive source in his hand, and the girl on the right who's got the source on the ground. Which one's going to have a higher exposure, and why? The guy, because of the distance, but there's something else going on here too. In contact, but it's also because the source is, what can absorb the radiation? It's air in his body. Whereas here, half of the radiation is being absorbed by the soil, by the ground. So her exposure is going to be a lot less. And it's further away. Let's say this drum is full of water. Which side would you want to be on? Left side or right side? Obviously on the other side here, you got the shielding to block let's say the gamma radiation. Heavy equipment, nice thick steel, it's great for shielding and blocking beta and gamma. And in severe cases, we've done this technique before. We've dug a hole, whoops, and put the source in the bottom of it. Soil is pretty dense. Cover it up, and now we've contained the source, stopped exposure. Gotta come back and get it someday, but time being, not a bad way of dealing with it. So for PPE, the only reason we wear PPE is to keep our skin from getting contaminated. And wearing a respirator to keep us from inhaling or ingesting the material. It's not stopping the radiation, it's really providing a little protection. That's the purpose of it. Yes?
Do you know if the P100, the particulate filter, is adequate for radiation for alpha?
So the cartridges for an air purifier respirator are meant to filter out particulate. And what we're concerned with is not the alpha, the beta, the gamma. We're concerned about the radioactive material, the actual radioactive material. And that will filter out particulate. So if I shred this up and put it into the air or in a respirator, very little is going to get through. So yes, they are protective. In fact, when we're conducting a cleanup in a highly contaminated area, we don't wear the supplied air like firefighters. We just wear the cartridges respirator. It's not necessary to be on air.
When doing an initial inspection, should we have respirators?
Well, that's a good question. Should you wear a respirator when you're conducting an inspection? I would think it depends on the situation. An inspection implies you're at an active facility that has some type of human beings that are working there, and there's activities going on that are being monitored and regulated. So if it's not meant to have radioactive materials, I wouldn't worry about it. If it's a place that has radioactive materials, they should have a license. If they have a license, they're going to have controls, and I wouldn't worry about it. There's only certain areas that you would go into that require respiratory protection, and they're going to be posted, and the facility owner is going to make sure you're dressed out correctly. Now, that all said, there's always that one case in a million. You go to a facility, you don't know what they have, they don't know what they have. Of course, that can happen. That can happen anytime, anywhere, not just radiological, but chemical, biological. And those you can't predict. But I think for the most part, an inspector doesn't have to worry about an exposure. And if they do, the facility should have the controls in place. So again, our PPE is just to keep us from getting contaminated, and it doesn't make a difference what you're wearing. It's just keeping the contamination off your skin is the main purpose. Now, one way we can protect ourselves is by using an instrument called dosimetry. A dosimeter is a way to record the amount of dose to your body. And you've probably seen different types of dosimeters, especially when you go to a hospital. And a popular one is called a TLD Badge. And it looks similar to this. They come in different shapes and forms and such. But someone wears it on their lapel or somewhere between their waist and their neck, and it records the amount of mostly high energy beta and gamma radiation. And it's something that's sent to a laboratory. They analyze it either monthly, every quarter, every 6 months, and they send a report and tell you what your exposure is. And that's all fine and dandy. It's legal documentation for your employer what your exposure is. It doesn't do you any good if you're out on an incident or working on a cleanup site. You need something that gives you real-time information. And the three main types I will talk about that are available on the market are these. There's pocket dosimeters, which I do not recommend. They're pretty cheap. They're hard to use, hard to read. Just not a great tool for being in the field. More appropriate for laboratory type of use. This product is made by a company called Canberra. Very, very popular with firefighters, hazmat teams. It is a very robust dosimeter. It also acts as a mini radiation detector because it can read out in micro to Rankine per hour range. It can be fully immersed in water, so it's completely decountable. Great little instrument. When we talk about exposure to people, as I mentioned, cumulative dose, it's bad. We want to reduce our exposure as much as possible. So we practice something called ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. And it's a protection method to reduce the exposure to people as much as we can within some reason. Now that's very loosey-goosey, and it's a judgment call. You know, what are the actions you're taking, and is it worth the risk of having an exposure? How much is that exposure? Well, there's things that we can do to reduce your dose. Very simple things. Limit the amount of time you're exposed. We've learned about that. Increase your distance from the source. You know, you're investigating an area that's highly radioactive. You don't stand there and take notes. You walk back over here and take notes. Just a few feet can make a big difference. Shielding. You saw the water wall example we had. It can be helpful. Rotate teams with a new team. One team goes in for half an hour, they come out. Another team goes in for half an hour. It's called dose sharing. Everyone gets a little bit of exposure. No one gets a lot. You know, reduce the number of people that actually have to go in to an area. You know, most of you work for government organizations. You know, you got to have 8 people watching one guy work. That doesn't work for this. Send in 1 guy, 2 guys to do the work. Everyone else, they're out here. Dosimetry we talked about, and then, of course, using our dose limits. And we always want to start low, way less than the regulatory limits. And we say, our daily limit's going to be whatever, 1 millirem, 5 millirem per day. And if we have to exceed that, we'll increase it. But we start low, and then we work up. And there's other techniques, but we want to reduce exposure as much as possible. Any questions about health effects, exposure, protection methods? Then let's talk about sources. Where does all this radiation come from?